Dear friends, welcome back to the second part of our discussion on the methods of cultural studies. You are aware that we have already presented a video on the methods of cultural studies and its first part. In that first part, we were talking about the different methods and methodology used in cultural studies, or rather not the methodologies but methods used in cultural studies. And in our discussion in the previous video, we started talking about a topic called circuit of culture. And within circuit of culture, we talked about representation, identity, production, consumption and regulation, and we analyzed these five aspects with reference to television. So we talked about television and representation, we talked about television and identity, we talked about production and television and production, we talked about television and consumption, we talked about television and regulation. So that way we looked at these five aspects of the circuit of culture. I repeat, they are called as representation, identity, production, consumption and regulation. Then in the previous lecture, we also talked about the various key areas in our effort to understand the modes of production of meaning. We talked about different key areas that cultural studies considers, and one was language and discourse, which we talked about in the previous lecture. We also talked about identity in our previous lecture, and we will be talking about the remaining things in our lecture today. The remaining things as key elements which cultural studies considers in the production of meaning. So in order to understand the mode of the production of meaning, these things are considered by cultural studies. One was language and discourse, which we talked earlier. The other is identity. This also we talked earlier in the lecture, previous lecture. And we'll be talking about everyday life today. We will talk about ethnography, media studies, reception or audience studies, and we'll talk about cultural intermediaries. So these are the things we are going to talk today. So friends, let us begin with our discussion on everyday life, that how everyday life can be seen as a key element in the mode of the production of meaning. So friends, cultural studies considers everyday life quite a lot. Everyday life and the consideration of everyday life is a very important aspect of cultural studies. So cultural studies, we can say that it takes everyday life very seriously. But a very unfortunate part is that it considers, or it talks about, or it refers to the lives in the everyday life in the metropolitan cities. It considers everyday life in big cities. And while doing this consideration of everyday life in the metropolises or in the big cities, unfortunately, cultural studies is unable to consider or the life in smaller cities, you can say, or the life in the rural areas, you can say. So that is a very unfortunate part. But anyways, let us start our discussion on that how everyday life forms as a or works as a key element in the production of meaning. Friends, everyday life is a site, SITE. Everyday life is such a site that it is multi-layered and it is contested. Everyday life is about the practices of the routine. It is about the routine life that we practice in our life every day, things that we follow, things that we do, acts and events that we do in our everyday life. So it is the practices of the routine that is considered in everyday life. It is about the lifestyle that we spend every day, the way of living, that how we live every day. It talks about consumption, the things that we consume in our everyday life, and it also talks about our social interactions and our relations with reference to everyday life. So, the cultural is constituted by the social. Will you agree with me that the cultural aspect of human life is constituted by the social aspect of human life? But there is a vice versa situation also. The social constitutes the cultural, correct? But the cultural also constitutes the social. So the cultural is constituted by the social, it also constitutes the social. The cultural also constitutes the social. That is, the social realm of the society or the society itself is constituted by the cultural artifacts, and the cultural artifacts are produced by the society. So there is a correlation. The societal, the social can be constituted and is constituted by the cultural artifacts, and the cultural artifacts are constituted by the social, right? The cultural artifacts are not only produced by the social, it is also consumed by the social. So production and consumption of culture, we talked about this in our discussion on production and consumption of culture, that how cultural artifacts are produced by the society and how cultural artifacts are consumed by the society, right? So cultural artifacts in the social realm can be studied through the analysis of everyday life. Since the cultural is produced by the societal or the social, so that is why when we study everyday life, it is quite easy and it is quite understandable that we can basically understand, we can basically study the cultural artifacts. So that is why I am saying that cultural artifacts in the social realm can be studied through the analysis of everyday life. So, while analyzing everyday life, cultural studies accounts for subjectivity in the response of the people. Note this. Cultural studies, when it analyzes everyday life, it accounts for the subjectivity in the response of the people. Friends, this subjectivity element or this subjectivity part is ignored in sociological studies. In order to keep itself neutral, objective, etc., the sociological studies actually ignore the subjective part or the subjective response of the people, whereas cultural studies takes into account the subjective response of the people in everyday life or in day-to-day life. So cultural studies actually takes into account the emotional response of the people towards things or events or happenings. So it is very important to note this emotional response of the people towards things. Cultural studies considers this emotional and the subjective as a part of our identity. So everyday life is specific to locations and culture. What do I mean by this? That everyday life is specific to locations and culture. For example, my dear friends, the life in London cannot be similar to the life in Delhi, for example, or Mumbai, for example, or any city of any other world, for example. So the life, everyday life in London is not the same as in Chandigarh, for example. So thus, cultural artifacts and cultural events and cultural objects are located and structured in different locations. Cultural events, cultural artifacts, and cultural objects are structured very differently in different locations. So, experience is the cornerstone of everyday life. Another aspect, that experience, our day-to-day experience, your experience, right? So experience is the cornerstone of everyday life. How we experience traffic, how we experience public life, how we experience clothing, how we experience food, how we experience fashion and social relations, how we experience the community and the community life, how we experience the different modes of entertainment. So, this constitutes our everyday life. This constitutes our everyday culture. I repeat that experience is the basic, experience is at the center, experience is the cornerstone of everyday life. And it is important that how we experience traffic in our everyday life, public sport, public transport, public sports, clothing, how we experience clothing, how we experience food, how we experience fashion, how we experience social relations, how we experience community and community life, how we experience entertainment. So it is important, and these experiences with regard to all these aspects constitute our everyday culture. So cultural studies, friends, foregrounds experience. Cultural studies foregrounds experience, but it sees experience as the means to analyze the relations that construct reality. It sees experience as the means to analyze the relations that construct reality. And why it does so? In order to make this shift from experience to reality, in order to make this shift from experience to reality, cultural studies underscores the textual and the linguistic aspect of experience. You know, in order to make this shift from experience to reality, cultural studies underscores the textual and the linguistic aspect of experience. Friends, you will agree with me that experience is articulated through language. Experience is expressed through language. How we express what we experience is very important. How we express what we experience is very important. How we speak with others, interact with others, our relations, day to day relations, social relations, interactions. So, how we speak with others is important. And how we narrate our stories, how we narrate our experiences, how we tell our stories, that is important. So, when we listen to others, we decode their meanings. When we talk to others, we encode our meanings which the others decode, So that in that same way, when we are speaking to others, when we are talking and interacting with others, we are actually encoding our experience that is meant to be decoded by the listener. Similarly, when we listen to others, we decode their meaning. We mediate their experiences through language. We mediate their experiences through language. We also mediate their experiences through the shared cultural codes. And we talked in the very earlier part of our discussions. We talked about shared experiences of culture, and we said that culture is a very shared thing, right? So while we listen to others, we decode their meanings, we mediate their experience through language and the shared codes. So, language and representation are therefore integral to human experience. Language and representation are therefore integral to the experience and the construction of reality. So, in construction of reality, in our day to day, everyday life experience, language and representation forms a very integral part. So, if experience and everyday life are central to culture, then it is important to see how these experiences of everyday life become languages, images, and representations. Look here, this may be complicated. That languages, images, and representations are formed by our experiences of everyday life. This is what I'm saying. So, if experience and everyday life are central to culture, then it is important to see how these experiences of everyday life become languages, images, and representations. The interest of cultural studies in everyday life proceeds from what Raymond Williams calls lived cultures. And what is this lived cultures? Where culture is produced through everyday living. This is what lived culture is, where culture is produced through everyday living. The food people eat, the fashions they adopt, the entertainment they prefer, the festivals they celebrate, etc., etc. So this is what Raymond Williams meant when he coined this phrase lived cultures. So I was saying that the interest of cultural studies in everyday life proceeds from the concept of lived cultures. So, cultural studies, my dear friends, thus believes that people leading their everyday life produce culture. This is the belief, and this is what cultural studies looks at. That people leading their everyday life produce culture. It is it is not that culture is produced somewhere else and it is brought into everyday life and it is consumed. No, not at all. It is not like that. That culture is a distinct culture is produced in some distinct arena, in some distinct realm. It is not that culture is produced elsewhere to be brought into the society and to the everyday life and to be consumed by the people. It's not like that. It is produced in the society itself and it is consumed in the society itself. And as we said earlier, vice versa, it can also produce the society. So, culture is the consequence of experiences and responses. The production of culture in everyday life is the experiences that we have in everyday life, the responses that we have in everyday life. So, cultural studies and we investigate this process of making culture. This process is linked again. I would like to say that this process is linked to the relationships of power. This process of making culture within everyday life is linked to the relationships of power. We have talked a lot about how power operates, so I don't feel any need to discuss the role of power in the production and consumption of culture. We have talked about it earlier in quite detail, and I hope and I wish that you are aware about it. So let us talk something else now. Lifestyle and consumption of cultural artifacts in everyday life go together. Our lifestyle and the consumption of cultural artifacts in our everyday life go together. There is a consumerist ideology working in all of us. You like it or hate it, but there is a fact that there is some type of a consumerism working in all of us. You will not deny. We are all consumers in some way or the other. So there is a consumerist ideology at work in all of us. This ideology emphasizes leisure and pleasure. So every consumerist ideology emphasizes leisure and pleasure. A consumerist ideology links pleasure to consumption. So pleasure is also linked with consumption. And when you can get pleasure, when you have leisure. So that's why I was saying that the consumerist ideology emphasizes about leisure and pleasure. A consumerist ideology links pleasure to consumption. In fact, for cultural studies, consumerism is itself a form of identity. In cultural studies, we talk about consumerism as a form of identity. Now, let us come to a question and let us try to answer that question. How does, my dear friends, how does cultural studies document the experience of everyday life? How does cultural studies record the experience of everyday? This is our hypothetical question, that how does cultural studies record or document the experience of everyday? Friends, there are two methods used in cultural studies with regard to the documentation or the recording of everyday experience. What are those two methods? So, two very common methods are used in cultural studies for the process of documenting or recording the experience of everyday life. So one is a very active method and the other is a sort of a passive method. Let us discuss the first method. The first method, in the first method, sorry, in the first method, cultural studies asks the people to record their experience of living within particular locations. In the first method, cultural studies asks the people to record their experience of living within particular locations. Or rather, you can say like this way, that it records, cultural studies records the experience of the people in their living in their particular locations. What do I mean by location here? Any place? Yes, correct. Any geographical area? Yes, correct. But I also mean, by location, I also mean community, caste, class, maybe several other things also. So cultural studies look at this method in this way, that it asks people to record their experience of living within particular locations. It then documents these autobiographical narratives. Then you record your experience, you document your experience, and this is your autobiographical narrative. So cultural studies then documents, records the autobiographical narratives as source material, as evidence for a particular culture, and then it theorizes about it. It theorizes about the culture of that particular society. So this approach is a standard component of cultural studies interested in the reception and audience studies theory. This, this approach is a standard component of cultural studies interested in the reception and audience side of culture. The subject is not merely embedded in the context, but the subject actively produces the context. The subject is not simply embedded in the context, but it actively produces the context. So it is the subject's experience and responses that shape the context and the meanings of cultural artifacts. This approach gives a very active role to the subject. This method gives a very active role to the subject. Now let us come to the second method, which looks primarily at how structures generate representations. The method that primarily looks at how structures generate representations. The discursive or the addresser side of the image or text. The addresser side, the discursive side of the image or text, rather than the interpretive or the addressee side. So rather than considering the interpretive or the addressee side, which the first method looks at, here we talk about the discursive or the addresser side of the image. Wait a minute, please. Right. So this assumes a degree of powerlessness, where discourses and representations govern the individual and control the subject's experience. The context of representation, like gender, class, race, etc., are given greater role in this approach. The context of representation, like gender, class, race, etc., are given greater role in this approach. So older forms of identity structures are breaking up nowadays. You will agree with me that the forms of identity in our older societies, yeah, what you can say, the older forms of identity structures based on religion, caste, uh, uh, class, etc., etc., these are now breaking up. This is a time for individual identity. I don't know, I'm not sure when I'm saying this how much I mean it, because the unfortunate part is that there is huge radicalization these days. There is huge, what you can say, fanatic approach these days, right? And we are becoming more and more conscious about, or rather, we are more and more radicalized and fundamentalized because of our religion and in our approach towards religion and caste and color and race, etc., etc. But cultural studies says that the older forms of identity are breaking up. This is a time of more individual based identity. And in this individual based identity, lifestyle is the new norm. Lifestyle is the new normal. So our identities nowadays, cultural studies says, is more based on the new norm of lifestyle rather than the older forms of identity structures. So it is a mode of interaction and it bestows a degree of individualism. This lifestyle is the new identity when we say this. So this is a new mode of interaction, and it is the mode of interaction, and it bestows a degree of individualism. It is what you do. Lifestyle क्या है? What is your lifestyle? How you live, and certainly you try to live differently from the others. You try to develop your own lifestyle. Yeah, you belong to a particular group which lives in a particular kind of lifestyle, or वहाँ पे religion and caste and color, these things does not matter. Do not matter. What matter is your similarity of lifestyle. So you try to live with, you try to interact with, you try to make relations with those kind of people who have identically similar kind of lifestyles. So it is what you do, it is what you wear, it is what you eat that identifies you, that gives you an identity. What you do, what you wear, and what you eat gives you the identity. So आपने देखा होगा, you must have seen that nowadays, in recent days, बल्कि in recent days, even you have seen the Prime Minister of India saying that लोग कपड़ों से पहचाने जाते हैं. You have heard a lot of killings happening in the name of what you eat. You must have seen a lot of responses, social, political responses, because of what the other, whom we consider the other, do. Right? So it is what you do, what you wear, and what you eat that identifies you, and not where you come from, and what is your family name, and what is your class, and what is your race, and what is your religion. ये cultural studies मानता है. This is what cultural studies believes. How much this is correct, I don't know. But yes, that part you will agree that it is your identity is marked with what you do, with what you wear, with what you eat. Whether it really matters where you come from, or where what your family name is, or what your caste or religion is, I hope you can well understand. But anyway, let us theorize it in this way, that cultural studies believe that the old structures of identity are breaking, and instead of the old structures of identity, the lifestyle identity is the new normal, and it is your mode of interaction with others, it is your mode of individualism that gives you an identity. Right? It is what you do, it is what you wear, it is what you eat that identifies you, rather than where you come from and what your family name is. So lifestyle is a matter of individual's choice. But again, I disagree with this. I'll come to this, I'll come back to this. But lifestyle is not a matter of choice, my dear friends. Lifestyle can be a matter of choice to a very select people. But sometimes lifestyle is a matter of compulsion. Lifestyle is a matter of necessity. Sometimes it is a matter of compulsion. मैं वैसी लाइफस्टाइल नहीं गुजारना चाहता हूँ जैसा मैं गुजारने पे मजबूर हूँ, because the conditions around me, my socio-economic conditions or my political conditions are compelling me to lead that kind of a lifestyle, right? So when I am leading a specific or a particular kind of lifestyle, it is not necessary that it is my choice. It is my compulsion that the circumstances may have, the political system might have, the socio-economic conditions might have compelled me to lead that kind of a life. Anyway, so this is my side of looking at the things, but let us once again come back to cultural studies and our discussion. Lifestyle cultural studies says that lifestyle is a matter of individual's choice. Therefore, it is also lifestyle is also a key component of his or her agency. Do remember we have already talked about agency, right? So lifestyle is a matter of individual's choice, and therefore it is a key component of his or her agency. So, lifestyle choices or the choices of lifestyle enable the individual to discover and create his or her own identity. The choices of lifestyle enable the individual to discover and to create his or her own identity, no matter what his or her background is. I will disagree with this once again, that background matters. And sometimes I am bound to lead a particular kind of a lifestyle because of my background. Sometimes this foundation is coming from within myself. Sometimes it is a societal foundation. Sometimes it is a religious foundation. Sometimes it is an economic foundation. Sometimes it is a political foundation also. That I am bound to lead a particular kind of a lifestyle because of my own choice, yeah, because of the compulsions. So this is again, I'm saying that this is again my point of view, but let us once again come back to the cultural studies side and what it says. It says that lifestyle choices or the choices of lifestyle enable the individual to discover and create his or her own identity, no matter what his or her background is. Thus, everyday life is a place where the individual becomes central. Everyday life is a place where the individual becomes central. The individual's subjectivity is crucial, and it is a very crucial element in everyday life. So, the individual in this globalized culture is an active agent. The individual in globalized culture is an active agent. The individuals are aware of their appropriation of global cultures, often transforming the global into the local, the global into their own native context. Since the individual in this global or globalized culture is an active agent, hence the individual is aware about his appropriation of global culture, hence he often transforms the global in his own native context. So everyday life is a site of a struggle over meaning. We are introducing one more aspect, everyday life as a site of a struggle. when I was talking earlier that everyday life is contested, right? So everyday life is a site of a struggle over meaning, conflicting sources, global and local, conflicting sources, battle for supremacy. Sometimes the global wants to dominate, sometimes the local wants to shot back. And you must have listened about, you must have heard about a lot of emphasis being given by the political leaders about the use of the local, how much true it is, how much practically possible it is, and how they themselves are serious about it. I don't know, I doubt rather. But everyday life is a struggle of, is a struggle over meaning. This is what I was talking about. Conflicting sources like the global sources and the local sources. So these conflicting sources battle for supremacy. Let us try to understand this with an example that how the global and the local battle for supremacy. Should we buy khadi even though khadi is more expensive than the Egyptian cotton that we have imported in our country? So this is a question that haunts us, and it is a matter to look at, it is a matter to notice that how we are going to respond to this. If we buy khadi in spite of the fact that Egyptian cotton is cheaper, we are preferring the local. So it is this, the supremacy comes to the local, or ignoring khadi, we go for the Egyptian cotton for the sake of saving some money. So it is the global that gets the supremacy. So there is always a contest going on. There is always a struggle going on in the production of meaning. Conflicting sources like the global and the local are battling it out for supremacy, right? My dear friends, everyday life generate multiple identities. Everyday life, as it generates multiple meanings, similarly, everyday life generates multiple identities. Places and people have become increasingly mobile. Even places have become mobile. They remain static, but still they are moving. And what way moving? Because they are impressed by the global culture or the globalized culture, right? So places and people have become increasingly mobile, multicultural, and hybridized. I repeat, everyday life generates multiple identities. And why this multiple identity is being generated? Because places and people have become increasingly mobile, multicultural, and hybridized. Friends, cultural studies sees identities in the cities, and as I said earlier, the metropolitan and the big cities. This is what cultural studies look towards. So this is the shortcoming of cultural studies actually. So cultural studies sees identities in the metropolises as increasingly linked to consumption and lifestyles. Whereas these things are now coming to our smaller cities and our subdivisional townships also, and even to our villages also, these things are no more unknown. So, cultural studies sees identities in the cities as increasingly linked to consumption and lifestyles. The metropolitan everyday life or the everyday life in the cities today is simultaneously local and simultaneously global together. So the metropolitan everyday life, the city life, even our life in villages now have become simultaneously local and global. Friends, everyday life today is a hybrid of local and global. No pure local culture exists now. At least in the cities तो हम ये कह सकते हैं, we can say very surely that no pure local culture exists in our cities. Everyday life gives us multiple identities, multicultural identities, a sort of a melange or melange, melange. I pronounce it as melange. So, everyday life gives us multiple identities. Our places also have multiple identities. Try to understand. Even our places have multiple identities. One single road, you might have observed this, one single road showcases all the global consumer and lifestyle brands. So, this is the global side. Whereas the traffic and the chaos on that road is typically local. It is very interesting that one single road in our city showcases all the global consumer goods and global consumer lifestyle brands, all the showrooms, beautiful showrooms there on one single road, having all the famous brands of the world on one single road of your city. So this is truly global. Whereas the traffic on the road, the chaos on the road, the stray animals on the road, this is typically local. So people are disobeying traffic rules sitting in their Audi cars. People are disobeying traffic rules sitting in their foreign produced cars. So the car is global, but their disobeying the rule is local. And all of us are doing this. We are riding on imported bikes, purchased it in lakhs and more than lakhs of rupees, right? But we are breaking the traffic norms of the city. Unruly drivings, careless drivings, careless things. Careless in the sense not about myself. It is basically an approach to show that in front of my car and me, in front of myself and my branded motorcycle, you are nothing. So in order to establish that you are nothing, I'll be doing all those kind of violation of traffic norms and things. When that bike of mine creates a lot of noise on the city road, it is a matter of pride for me. So every place is a hybrid of the local and the global. London and New York are now post-colonial hybridized cities. You can find a lot of India there in London. You can find a lot of India there in New York. So London and New York are now post-colonial hybridized cities. Bhangra is as American as it is Punjabi or Indian. Bhangra as an American pop, for example, or the American food in the streets of Manchester. Very sorry, the Indian food in the streets of Manchester, for example, either or the Chinese restaurants in our cities, for example, right? And can you remember what Tony Blair, the ex-British Prime Minister, said? He said that Indian foods are now the national cuisine of Britain. So instead of local cities, we are now having ethnoscapes. This is a term we are now using for our cities. ethnoscapes. So instead of localized cities, we are now having the globalized cities. We are now having ethnoscapes, and those globalized cities are having the local. So that is why I said that New York or London or Manchester are no more typically British, typically American, typically English, or typically American. They are post colonial hybridized cities. So instead of local cities, now we have ethno escapes. For reference, the local is now homogeneous, whereas the global is heterogeneous. Balki, it's not a matter of now. Local is always homogeneous, and the global is heterogeneous. Contemporary everyday life is a mix of these two. The homogeneous aspect of our life and the heterogeneous life aspect of our life. So when we are preferring the local, we are preferring the homogeneous. When we are becoming global, we are preferring the heterogeneous. So contemporary everyday life is a mix of the two. Thus, both homogenization and heterogenization are central to our everyday life. At least this we can say for sure with regard to our urban life, with our city life. So heterogenization and homogenization are central to our everyday life today. Robertson Robertson calls this mix of the global and the local as glocal, GLOCL. Do remember that this term glocal, which is now very much in fashion today, is given by Robertson. So, everyday life, my dear friends, is fragmented. It has multiple space where meanings are hybridized and contested. Cities and identities that we are once more or less homogeneous in terms of ethnic identities and patterns of consumption, they are completely hybrid. So there are some homogeneous elements in our cities and city life. There are certain heterogeneous things in our city and city life, right? So that is why we are basically in the time of hybridization. So what does a hybrid life mean? Let us now ponder over this question. That what does our hybrid life mean? Friends, it means that our experiences are not restricted to one race or one culture. It also means that our identities are drawn from multiple global sources. And it also means that our values are inspired by global culture. So even our values of life are also inspired by global culture. The workplace culture is a good example to understand this. That the workplace culture often adopts values from the parent company. And if the parent company is from America, based in Hyderabad, the workplace culture of that company, though it is based in Hyderabad, will be adopting its work culture values from America. So, everyday lifestyle cultures modify the use and meaning of global objects. For example, a cell phone like Nokia is putting local film songs as its tunes. है ना? The cell phones are using local languages for their messaging. A dupatta on a Levi's jeans is a very common sight in our cities nowadays. है ना? And the experiment of McDonald's with the local food items and with the local recipe is a very normal phenomenon. So the local is not necessarily marginalized in the consumerist everyday life. Normally it is said. So sometimes the local is marginalized, yes, correct. But the local is not necessarily marginalized in the consumerist everyday life. Sometimes the local is emphasized. So when we are wearing a kurti over a Levi's jeans, when we are putting a dupatta over a Levi's jeans, a sports shoe, a Levi's jeans, a kurti and a dupatta. So what we are doing is that we are doing something local. So we cannot say that everyday life is dominated or taken over by the global culture. Rather, it actually has hybridized. So actually, everyday life is fairly contested, where the meanings of the global cultural artifacts are reinvented, are reinscribed in the native way. So wearing a kurta over a jeans and putting a gamcha on our shoulder over a jeans, right, is a common phenomenon. So the local is not necessarily marginalized in the consumerist everyday life. Sometimes it is emphasized. We cannot say that everyday life is dominated or taken over by the global cultures. Actually, everyday life is fiercely contested, where the meanings of global cultural artifacts are reinvented, are reinscribed by the native cultures. So the consumer is not simply the passive recipient of global cultural icons. He is not accepting the global cultural artifacts passively. Rather, the consumer modifies what he or she receives to suit his or her own purposes or fashion or sense of fashion, and engages with the global culture in a native way, often redoing the global to fit into the local. Friends, now let us come to another topic, and that is post colonialism and cultural studies. So, how these two are correlated, the post colonial and the cultural studies, rather, post colonialism as a theory, right? And the cultural studies, and how these two are interconnected and how it works to create meaning, right? So, globalization, my dear friends, has a sustained engagement with the local culture. It also has a sustained influence on the local culture. So, scholars are of the opinion that the role to globalization has to be seen with the post colonial lens. The role of globalization has to be seen with the post colonial lens, because post colonial studies is concerned with the oppression of the non Europeans by the Europeans. Hence, cultural studies in these global times must be conscious of the racialized nature of the global culture. देखिए मैं बहुत ही आई एम टॉकिंग अबाउट अ वेरी juxtaposed kind of a thing, a very controversial kind of a thing, that the global culture is also racialized. So the theme of race and unequal relations has to be worked into any analysis of global culture. The theme of race and unequal relations has to be worked into any analysis of global culture. For example, we should ask how Hollywood films are circulated now globally. Does the fact that audience in Asian or African countries will be viewing the film influences the filmmaker? So when a Hollywood producer When a Hollywood director is making a Hollywood film, does he consider the choices and the taste of his viewers sitting in the Asian and the African countries? So, how does a Hollywood film appear to the poor nations, for example? Friends, cultural theorist Simon During or During. So this Simon During gives a set of reasons for connecting post-colonialism with studies related to globalization. And I am taking three things from Simon During. All culture now is linked with the supply of money. This is what Simon During says, that how all culture now is linked with the supply of money. All cultures now have transnational subsidiaries, opponents, and collaborations. All cultures now have transnational subsidiaries, opponents, and collaborations. And the last thing about Simon During is, from Simon During, is that cultures are no more territorial, hence do not cohere or fuse into wholes or traditions. Friends, now let us ponder about these things in detail. Culture is increasingly mediated by economy. During was saying that supply of money was he was talking about. So culture is increasingly mediated by economy, and it has increasingly little to do with traditions or territories. तो टेरिटरीज के साथ और ट्रेडिशंस के साथ कल्चर का रिश्ता कम या ख़त्म होता जा रहा है, एंड कल्चर इज इंक्रीजिंगली mediated by economy. Global economics and global media determine the aspect of culture. Global economics and global media determine what aspects of culture are to be adopted and what aspects of culture are to be abandoned. So when we are adopting a particular aspect of culture or when we are abandoning a particular aspect of culture without considering the tradition and the local aspect, our choice of adopting a particular aspect of culture or abandoning a particular aspect of culture is dictated by global economics and global media. Therefore, culture and traditions are modified, and culture and traditions are modified not with the local culture in mind but with the global considerations. Our choices are now determined by global economy. Colonialism, you will agree with me, was a kind of globalization. And that is why time and again you must have heard me saying this in my classroom, that this globalized culture is a kind of a neo-colonialism. It is a sort of a new colonialization that is going on. So colonialism is a kind of globalization where the European settlers impose their cultural moods on the colonized. You know this. You have read about it a lot. That how colonialism exerted pressure and tremendous pressure on our culture and our civilization and our nation. So colonialism was a kind of globalization where European settlers imposed their cultural moods on the colonized. Friends, this current phase of globalization is therefore one more moment of the colonial process. This is one more moment of colonialism. It is the new colonialism that is going on in the name of liberal economy and globalization. So indeed, my dear friends, globalization has become synonymous with westernization, colonialization, Europeanization, and Americanization. And since America dominates the present scenario in terms of politics, in terms of economy, in terms of socio-political conditions, etc., etc., so that is why time and again we say that globalization is actually Americanization. So contemporary globalization is also a mode of cultural exchange. Dropping this, I would like to tell that how China is trying to break this Americanization aspect. This is another part of history, right? Another part of our studies. You should consider about it also. Anyways, so contemporary globalization is also a mode of cultural exchange, appropriation, and marketing. Hence, contemporary cultural studies, my dear friends, examines the role of globalizing finances and markets in the formation of culture. Shared economies in globalization influence the cultural modes. Shared economies in globalization influence the cultural mode, and cultural studies as a field of study, as a field of research, is interested in this. However, should also be kept in mind that a culture cannot be reduced to its material goods or products only. A culture cannot be reduced to its material goods or products only. The presence of the American goods, foods, clothing, or movie may not mean an extensive Americanization is happening. So maybe there is a presence of American food and American goods and American clothing and American movies in your life. And now China is taking part of, China is overcoming this. So right, so the presence of American goods, foods, clothing, or movies may not mean that an extensive Americanization is happening. Hence, post-colonial studies must be conscious of 4 5 things. And what are those? Post-colonial studies must be conscious of the material nature of the product or object. Post-colonial studies must be conscious of the marketing and the symbolic value assigned to the product or the object. Post-colonial studies must be conscious of the economic gains and losses with the arrival of a global product. Post-colonial studies must be conscious of the share of the local culture and economy in the production and profits of the global product. And post-colonial studies must be conscious of the kind of images associated with the object. So let us now move on to cultural intermediaries. Let us now move on to cultural intermediaries. This term, my dear friends, was first introduced by the French theorist Pierre Bourdieu. And Bourdieu, Bourdieu, Bourdieu talks about cultural intermediaries. Cultural intermediaries are basically the things that come between you and the consumption of culture. So cultural intermediaries are those that mediate between the production of a cultural product or a cultural event and the consumer. And friends, the marketing agencies, the advertising agencies are the best example of this. Cultural intermediaries. So these cultural intermediaries create a link between the production and the consumption of culture. They also serve as a link between culture and economy. So the function of these cultural intermediaries is to create a desire among the consumers. This is their function, to create a desire among the consumer and to sell the product. How this creation of desire and the subsequent sale of the product is done, this is a question in cultural studies. This is a matter to look in cultural studies. This is a matter of research in cultural studies. Yeah, what cultural studies analyzes? How this creation of desire and the subsequent sale of the product is done. For example, the sale of a film. Look here, the marketing agency, and you must have seen on television there is a program coming up before the release of every film, the making of such and such movie, shown on the television channels. The release of the music first, and then the release of the trailer, and then the promotional events where the actors and the actresses are going into different television and film events. So the promotional events, the role of film magazines, the role of newspapers, reviews are coming, right? So the role of film magazines and newspapers and reviewers, the role of interview of the film stars coming before the release of the film. So this can be understood in a better way. It is possible that the cultural intermediaries may not have the knowledge of the actual process of the cultural production. The reviewer of the film does not know everything about the production history of a specific film, for example. So it is possible that the cultural intermediaries, the advertisement makers, the trailer makers, the television channel which is telecasting that particular promotion of the film, for example. So it is possible that the cultural intermediaries may not have the knowledge of the actual process of the production. For example, the columnist who is writing a pre-release review of a film, and is paid by the producer for this, right? So the columnist who is writing a pre-review release of the film, or the ad agency which is making a promotional video of the film, is not aware about the whole process of the production of that film, for example. Friends, fan clubs also work as cultural intermediaries. So you must have seen on your Facebook that you have Ajay Devgan fan club. You have, say for example, what you can say, Aishwarya Rai's fan club. So they mediate between the star and the consumer. Sometimes there are fan clubs in your cities also, and they organize different programs in the name of that star. So they mediate between the star and the consumer. They create an aura around the star. They perform as a sort of an extra cultural task when they appropriate a star for cultural programs or for philanthropic causes or for political parties, for example. So cultural studies is interested in cultural intermediaries as the makers of representation and also as the tools of marketing. Cultural intermediaries as the makers of representation and also as the tools of marketing. So these cultural intermediaries, my dear friends, generate income for the production as well as they generate income for themselves. All right, let us now move on to media and culture studies, how these two intertwine. Cultural studies, my dear friends, studies how communication and community is linked. Communication is about language, you will agree. Communication is about discourse and representation, you will agree. So representation is central to production, consumption, and mediation of cultural products. Representation is central to production, consumption, and mediation of cultural products. Hence, it is important to look at the structures and the technologies that produce representation. advertising, marketing, and the critique of it is all in which the media acts. So, mass media constitutes a public space. It generates debates, it influences opinions, and it creates markets. May or may not be the media is controlled by the state. We may also have state controlled media, and we may also have the private controlled media or the private channels, you can say. So may or may not be, it is controlled by the state, often controlled by large corporations also, and in any way it generates profits. So media and its role in the construction of cultural values, its circulation, its production of desire is central to the studies of cultural studies, is central to the discussion of cultural studies. So, studying media culture is not only to focus on the cultural aspects, but it also pays attention to the economics of media. So, cultural studies assume that media culture is ideological and political. Look here, this is very important. Cultural studies assumes that media culture is always number one, ideological, and it is number two, political. Media culture reproduces existing cultural values. It also represents the operations going on in the society. It also talks about the oppressions and inequalities that are happening in the society. So it reflects the multiple sides of the contemporary narrative. It reflects, media reflects the multiple side of the contemporary narratives. Friends, I'm saying this, and I'm saying this with all sincerity, that reading the media is always a political reading. When you try to study, when you try to analyze, when you try to evaluate the media and its working, its representations, its creation of values and cultural artifacts, and its creation of meaning, everything. So, reading the media is always a political reading. Media culture, my dear friend, helps to reinforce hegemony. It reinforces the power of a specific political or cultural or economic groups. It creates hegemony and it reinforces hegemony. It reinforces the power of a specific political or a specific cultural or a specific economic groups. So hence, representation in the media are suggestive and representation in the media are provocative. Representation in the media are suggestive because the media suggests ideologies that the audience, if not alert and aware, may imbibe. If the audience is not aware and alert, the audience is in the danger of adopting the ideology that media is talking about. So it need not announce its ideology or its position. It works it, है ना? It can do it very indirectly. It can do it very suggestively. आहिस्ता से करता है बात. Media is also provocative because media is provocative because it asks us to rethink what we know, and it influences us to change what we think and what we know, and it reinforces, sometimes it reinforces what we believe, and sometimes it wants to change what we believe. So rather than analyzing political programs, Cultural studies actually looks at media culture through an analysis of popular media culture through films and television serials and advertisements. Why so? This is because cultural studies believes that the popular cultural forms are tools of ideological and political powers. A film cannot promote an ideological or political view far more effectively than a daily news analysis. Because while watching a film, the audience is less on guards. आप उतना aware नहीं, you're not that much alert when you are using a daily news analysis, when you are looking at a political analysis program. So a film can promote an ideological or political view far more effectively than a daily news analysis. Because while watching a film, the audience is very less alert, he is very less on guards and sees it only as a source of entertainment. So, cultural studies of popular media culture involves an analysis of forms of representation, number one. Number two, an analysis of the political ideologies embedded in these representations, an examination of the financial sources and the sponsors of the representation. It also is an examination of the roles played by other objects, other people in the propagation or in propagating the ideology. So, cultural studies ask certain questions. For example, it asks, does the film or the serial, the television serial, present the oppressive, unequal nature of institutions, or does it glorify them? Does the film tell anything about resistance to oppressive ideologies? Who funds these films? Who has a stake in promoting and circulating such cultural ideologies? Who the how the audience responds to such representations? So these are different questions that cultural studies asks. Friends, you can very easily remember specific films pointed towards a specific states and the culture of the political culture of a specific states, or the political habits and the political acts of a specific political leaders. So films pointed pointedly made either to establish a political party or a political leader, or to dismantle a political party or a political leader, right? Very recently you can say that there was a specific, I don't want to name, there was a specific producer and director of Indian film industry who was one after another making deliberate films to malign a political leader of Bihar, for example, right? And that very show, that very film, I don't want to name the film once again, which raised the issue of mehengai, right? Before the elections, I don't want to name the elections also, right? Or a very media generated show of a particular very grand old man of Indian politics when he was sitting on a long dharna trying to become a Gandhi, right? And he failed miserably. You know that story. That but how that hocus pocus was created by the television. The live shows were made by the national television or the private channels, right? You know all these things. So, cultural studies of media culture explores media ecologies. For example, we look at the ecology of a film when we take it as an assemblage. A film as an assemblage. We have to look at the star and his personality. We have to look at the tools, the camera, the set, the lights, the devices used in the film. We have to look at the technicians. We have to look at the community involved in the making of that film, the film industry, the unions of the workers and the stars, the star relationships, etc. Right? The audience, for example, the marketing side, for example, the iconography, for example, TV anchors, for example, who talk about the films, the music albums, for example, parodies about the film, remixes about the film, the court cases, if any, about the film, the role of the government, the role of the state in the film if it is required, the promotional videos of the film, and the reviews, the pre and the after reviews of the film. Right. Now, with this, let us now move on to the last aspect of our discussion, and that is audience and reception studies. Friends, cultural studies explores the processes through which a culture produces meaning. We know that meaning is the effect of communication and representation. It is, meaning is negotiated through power relations. We know these things. We also know that communication is a two-way process. Hence, it is not only important to talk about the addresser side, but it is also important to talk about the side of the addressee. It is also important to see the side of the addressee. And who is the addressee? The audience, the one who is receiving. So that is why we talk about audience and reception studies. It is important to see how the representations, the cultural representations, how the representations are received and consumed by the consumers. And who is the consumer? The one who receives. And who is the one who receives? The audience, the listener, the user. Right. So therefore, audience studies or reception studies is a major component of cultural studies. And what do I mean by audience? Audience here includes the readers, the listeners, the viewers, right? Everybody. So reception is the way by which the audience react and internalizes the representations. All right. So reception is not a passive process, my dear friends. We modify images to suit our purposes. We modify images to suit our socio-cultural requirements. We modify images to suit our socio-political beliefs. So our process of interpretation as audience, our process of interpretation, which is central to the act of reception, is based on our cultural concepts. We function as audience, we function from within an interpretative community. We create cultural meanings through our appropriation and adaptation of cultural symbols and cultural icons. The audience creates its identities through the consumption and through the reception of cultural artifacts or cultural events or cultural objects, the cultural representations and the cultural meanings, you can say. So friends, that's all for today. Thank you very much.